The Cass Review. Rarely has a review into paediatric medicine been such a political bombshell.
This review strikes hard and strikes sure.
But when it was published earlier this month, that's precisely what Dr. Hilary Cass's final report into gender services for young people in England proved to be. It has blown apart the claims of the gender ideologues. It has exposed the fraudulent evidence base on which gender-affirming care rests, and it has vindicated the views of trans-skeptical voices who have been raising the alarm about the treatment of gender-confused children for decades. Once smeared and ignored by the mainstream media, they can be smeared and ignored no more. The unsayable has all of a sudden become sayable, on matters of gender at least. Cass, a former president of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, was commissioned to produce this report by the NHS back in 2020. This followed a string of scandals and controversies in England's so-called Gender Identity Development Service, or GIDS. Concerns had been raised by whistleblowers and journalists that confused, autistic and same-sex attracted young people were being pushed towards medical transition. After only a few sessions, they said, children were being placed on a pathway, moving from puberty blockers to cross-sex hormones and ultimately to sterilisation. All because they or their parents or their clinicians had become convinced they were born in the wrong body. Even before this final report arrived, Cass's work had already made a huge impact. Her interim report, published in 2022, precipitated the closure of GIDS, which had been based at the Tavistock Centre here in London. In March, NHS England announced it would no longer prescribe puberty blockers to gender-confused children, except for in clinical trials, all on Cass's advice. Many of the core findings of the now fully published, almost 400-page review will not be news to anyone who has followed the gender debate. Still, the moral weight of this report and this moment cannot be overstated. It shows in painstaking detail and with undeniable data-driven authority that the health service has been subjecting troubled youngsters to unevidenced experimental treatments. A mix of ideology, fear and self-censorship has produced a medical scandal of tremendous proportions. There is no good evidence, Cass writes in her report, on the long-term outcomes of interventions to manage gender-related distress. So-called puberty blockers were ushered in at NHS England based on a single Dutch study. But while these drugs are certainly effective at halting the natural march of puberty, and almost certainly come with other painful, lifelong side effects, no changes in, quote, gender dysphoria or body satisfaction, unquote, were demonstrated in the data. Despite this, Cass found that the vast majority of children put on puberty blockers move on to cross-sex hormones. While these drugs are sold to troubled families as a break on puberty, blockers in fact appear to be an accelerator towards transition and to sterility. There is no evidence that puberty blockers buy time to think, says Cass. There is also a lack of evidence, she adds, that hormones improve a young person's body satisfaction and psychosocial health. What's more, she says there is a concern over the impact on fertility growth and bone health. While cross-sex hormones are currently available to over 16s, Cass urges clinicians to use extreme caution before prescribing them. Even social transition, that is changing someone's name and pronouns and then presenting as the opposite sex, is not without its risks, says Cass. There is no clear evidence that social transition in childhood has any positive or negative mental health outcomes, she writes. However, those who had socially transitioned at an earlier age and or prior to being seen in a clinic were more likely to proceed to a medical pathway, unquote. In other words, social transitioning may not relieve young people's distress, but it does push them towards puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and all that comes with them. Cass, in a calm, objective but empathetic fashion, debunks the claims of the ideologues one after another. Trans activists have long said that trans kids must be uncritically affirmed and put on hormones, otherwise they will commit suicide. This horrendous bit of moral blackmail has been uttered time and again in gender clinics across the West in recent years. Would you rather have a trans kid or a dead kid, is how the more shameful activists like to put it to wary parents. But as many people already knew, there is nothing to back this up. The evidence found did not support this conclusion, is how Cass rather blankly puts it. The stats in the report about the explosion of kids accessing NHS gender care aren't new either, but they are still staggering. In 2009, the Gender Identity Development Service saw around 50 kids, predominantly boys. By 2016, it was closer to 2,000, and most of them were girls. The scale of the increase and this radical switch between boys and girls makes it incredibly unlikely that this is all down to children feeling more accepted and free to come out, as some would argue. Cass argues that online influencers have had a substantial impact, as she puts it, on some people's desire to transition.
Day 61 of being a girl.
Make no mistake, the Cass Review has bulldozered gender-affirming care. You can see this in the political response to it. Even the UK Labour Party, which has spent the past few years arguing about whether women can have penises, says it accepts the report and all of the recommendations in it. It looks like puberty blockers are going to be banned from private health clinics now too. But of course, the report hasn't sparked very much reflection at all among the committed gender extremists, those who have spent years cancelling people for saying what Hilary Cass has now put down in black and white. At first, trans activists tried desperately to square the circle, judging, probably correctly, that simply rejecting the report would make them look even more like science-denying cranks. Groups like Stonewall, the UK's leading LGBT charity, and Mermaids, a trans youth charity, put out hedgy statements suggesting that they agreed with much of the report, even though both of them continue to make dodgy, misleading claims about puberty blockers on their websites. Joe.co.uk's Ava Evans put out a clip accusing gender-critical campaigners of not reading the report, even though her own burblings on the subject suggested she hadn't got past the contents page.
I'm not saying they immediately have to access puberty blockers, even though some cases they might.
Trans writer Freddie McConnell wrote a piece in The Guardian, calling the report both mostly common sense and also riddled with anti-trans bias. Go figure. But then came the denialism. Protest singer Billy Bragg has been among those accusing Cass, a decorated paediatrician, of not knowing what she's talking about. He and others have been pushing a nonsense stat that Cass discarded over 100 studies on gender treatment and only included 2 in her final report. The implication seems to be that she is cherry-picking the data for some nefarious reason. This claim, needless to say, has been swiftly debunked. As Benjamin Ryan, a health and science reporter, points out, some studies were just given less weight than others due to how weak and shoddy they were. This is sort of what Cass was getting at when she said that gender medicine is built on shaky foundations. Cameron Abbasi, editor-in-chief of the British Medical Journal, has said Cass's critics are just revealing their own ignorance of science. That's what got us into this mess in the first place, he said. But what does he know, eh, Billy? I would tell Bragg to stick to his day job, but then he is the man who wrote this. The post-Cass meltdown is a reminder that the gender ideologues were never convinced by evidence, even at the clinical level. Shockingly, Dr. Cass says her research was actually thwarted by lack of cooperation from the adult gender services. She's told The Guardian she thinks this was coordinated and ideologically driven. The great and good came to be in thrall not just to a weird strain of pseudoscience, but a kind of religious cult. A cult which, despite its fantastical claims, an alarming number of people in politics and the media desperately wanted to believe in. Not because doing so would help those that they claim to be so concerned about, but because doing so would burnish their own credentials as nice, caring, progressive people. Well, given what we now know about the kids who have been experiencing gender distress, who have been showing up at these clinics, there is a deeply grim irony here. According to Cass, 89% of girls and 81% of boys referred to GIDS were same-sex attracted, many of whom will have just been confusing their sexuality for a supposedly misaligned gender identity. So, in the name of being inclusive and liberal, these activists have been cheering on the medical correction of gay kids. Meanwhile, those who were brave enough to speak out about what was going on were ignored and cancelled. For all the talk in recent weeks about the toxicity on both sides of the gender debate, the vitriol and the silencing was only ever coming from one direction. Intolerant trans activists created such profound fear of even discussing this issue that it has taken literally decades for us to get to this point. Susan Evans, who used to work in the now closed Tavistock clinic, first blew the whistle back in 2004 after learning that a 16-year-old had been referred for hormone treatment after just 4 appointments. 2004. Back then, Julie Bindel was still welcome at the Guardian Christmas party. Graham Linehan could walk through Muswell Hill without security detail. And J.K. Rowling was a beloved children's author who was only thought to be the devil by crazy American Christians. And yet, it has taken 20 years and the demonisation of those 3 skeptics and many more for the truth to become socially acceptable. The Cass Review has done a tremendous service to medicine and to the young people who have been sacrificed to this cruel ideology. But it has also shone an unforgiving light on our politics, media and cultural institutions. It shows us that for our supposed betters, virtue signalling and appearing to be on the right side of history has replaced genuine virtue and rational thought. Dr. Cass's report has not single-handedly pushed gender ideology out of our institutions, of course, no report could, but it has set them an important test. Confronted with the error of their ways, can our elites now right themselves, or are they too far gone to succumb to plain old facts? Will they rediscover reason and genuine tolerance, or will they remain under the spell of this cruel, homophobic cult? Will they ever admit that they got this so badly wrong? I dare say we're about to find out.